Welcome, dear viewer. I hope you are having a wonderful night. Tonight, I'll be telling some terrifyingly scary stories. I hope you are warm and ready. Let's begin. I've not seen my grandma since 2009. She had a catastrophic argument with my dad, but he used to be elusive about what actually transpired between them. Grandma moved away a few months later. I only know that because I remember cycling past her house and seeing it for sale. I was always certain she told my dad her new address, but he always refused my requests to visit her. Once, I did a little detective work and opened a letter addressed to my dad. I recognized Grandma's handwriting from birthday cards I'd received over the years. Dad scolded me for rummaging through his post, of course. He got all of his mail delivered to a separate PO box after that, stopping me from intercepting any more letters. Dear John, please forgive me. Mum. That was all it said. Unfortunately, there was no return address. Anyway, when my mom died in 2018, grieving became our sole focus. I stopped asking about my grandma. I didn't even really think about her for a long time. Just my mom. She'd been struggling with her mental health for a year, and she was missing for a few months before they found her body. I don't really want to talk anymore about that. I just thought I'd give some context before carrying on. It's been a painful few years. I haven't asked Dad about Grandma since I was a teenager, and I'm 24 now. To be honest, I decided a while ago that I was happy to move on with my life. It felt a little like the ship might have sailed. Dad's the only family I have left. I didn't want to irreparably ruin our relationship by persistently badgering him about his mother. But last night, something unexpected happened. Kara! Dad shouted from the living room. Gulping, I tentatively entered the room and chose an armchair opposite the sofa, on which he was slouched. I was panicking because I thought it might be time for a talk about me still living at home. I finished university a couple of years ago, and I've got a job in sales. But it doesn't pay nearly well enough for me to move out. Are you okay, Dad? I asked. He sighed. Yeah, I'm fine. But I've been thinking lately. Oh, I teased, hoping a classic dad joke might relieve some tension. It didn't. You've not asked me about Grandma for years, he said after a long pause. I was flabbergasted. Dad has never been the one to bring up my grandma, not since their unexplained estrangement. So I hardly knew how to respond. After several awkward seconds, I realized that I was simply sitting there, mouth agape, staring silently. My father adjusted his reading glasses, which were perched precariously atop his seemingly clammy nose and forever slipping down. I started to wonder why he looked so sweaty and anxious. Could this finally be it? I wondered. I'm coming to terms with things. For instance, you're not my baby girl anymore. You're old enough to go out and make your own decisions, he said, and I often find myself wondering whether you still want to see your grandma. I shrugged. I stopped asking about her because I could see how much it upset you. Dad smiled weakly. I know. We've been through a lot. But what I'm saying is that I'm aware of your age. You're an adult now. I worry sometimes that she might try to contact you. Maybe she already has. I shook my head. She hasn't. Dad seemed to ease up a little at hearing that. Good. That's good. But I realized that if I really want to keep you safe, I have to tell you why you shouldn't see your grandma if she contacts you. I nodded. It would help to know why you two fell out. Suddenly, it was Dad's turn to gulp. He shifted his body weight in his seat, stalling for time. I found my eyes wandering to the night sky outside our living room window. Torrential rain pummeled the tarmac of our sleepy road, and a solitary lamppost was scarcely visible through the cascading curtain of droplets on the glass. Your grandma and granddad always had a strained relationship. Dad eventually started. That's why I have so many issues, I think. I just hope none of that rubs off on you. My mom and dad were always good to me, but they weren't good to each other, and they seemed oblivious to the effect that had on me as a child. I nodded gently. I could remember Grandma and Granddad bickering throughout my early childhood, and then One day, my grandma left her. I always thought Mom was a bit too harsh on Dad for his long business trips. He was just trying to provide for us. But when he left her, I obviously empathized and took her side. So, I don't want you thinking of me as the bad guy, Dad said. I shook my head. Never. I'm dancing around the subject. You only have one question, I imagine, Dad said. What changed? Dad, you don't have to tell, I started. I do, he interrupted. If you stop me now, I might never summon the courage again. Okay. I found something shortly after your granddad left, Kara. I was clearing out your grandma's attic, and there was a cardboard box labeled a catalog. It was full of photos. I later learned about photos of missing people, and every person's story was the same. These candid photographs were taken from a distance, in parks and busy shopping centers, men and women. That wasn't what scared me. It was the photographs taken in the attic. Unimaginable brutality. I can't say any more than that. Quaking at a revelation I never expected to leave my father's lips, I sat in silence, processing the horrifying information. My mental cogs were turning, but I hadn't yet realized what I was still repressing. Anyway, when I confronted your grandma about it, she burst into tears. Dad croaked. She said it was the reason Granddad left. He discovered her secret. Obviously, I told her that I was going straight to the police, and she just said she understood. She didn't try to stop me. But she fled that very night, 14 years later. There's still no sign of her. I just hope that wherever she went, she stopped taking people, and that was it. My dad's terrible story, I couldn't find any suitable words, so I stopped searching for any. We both sat for a prolonged period of silence, watching the rain continue to beat down on the world outside. A world that suddenly looked a little darker to me. Eventually, I went to bed, but I didn't sleep. I couldn't sleep. My head was whirring, but not for the reasons one might expect. You see, Dad's story didn't fully add up. I'd remembered something. I used to stay at my grandparents' house from time to time, and they'd often let me bring a friend or two, given I was an only child, and they didn't want me to endure a boring sleepover with two oldies. They knew who I'd invite. It was always the same two girls. Sophie and Francesca, in fact, they often insisted on me inviting my best friends. And my friends loved my grandparents. Well, mainly, they loved the sweets Grandma and Granddad would give us before bed, plying us with succulent, sugary goodness that should have kept us awake all night. And yet, we always slept like babies. Well, not every time. One night, when I was around 6 or 7 years old, I awoke in the early hours of the morning. It was still dark outside. I felt unbelievably groggy, as if someone had wrapped an elastic band around my brain and restricted the blood flow. But after a few seconds, I became aware of my surroundings and noticed that while Francesca was fast asleep, Sophie's sleeping bag was empty, and the door to my bedroom, Dad's old room, wide open. I eyeballed the pitch black upstairs, landing through the doorway. My eyesight was hazy, and I'm sure I wouldn't have been able to see a thing anyway. But my ears, on the other hand, were working perfectly. That must have been what woke me up. The sound of creaking floorboards above my head came from the attic. My immediate thought was that Sophie was messing around up there, and I worried that I was about to be in big trouble with my grandparents. So I gingerly rose to my feet, almost passing out as I did, and tiptoed quietly out of my bedroom, trying to navigate the blackened landing. I didn't want to turn on any lights and wake Grandma or Granddad. But the creaking attic floorboards persisted, along with a muffled voice, and I knew it was only a matter of time before my grandparents woke up anyway. "Sophie," I hissed, hoping she would hear and my grandparents wouldn't. The abnormally loud creaking immediately subsided, and I held my breath as I finally accepted something. Those can't be Sophie's footsteps. I hurriedly crept back to bed as the floorboards, like wooden piano keys, creaked hurriedly across the length of the ceiling. I managed to slide under my duvet cover and close my eyes as the attic door opened with a giant groaning noise. It was followed by someone very heavily clambering down the ladder. I remember striving feverishly to feign that I was asleep as the unknown figure lumbered across the landing. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying not to cry as I listened to the strained breathing of the figure who had stopped in the doorway, the figure who was clearly watching me. I didn't need to open my eyes to know that. It wasn't Sophie. It was the bogeyman. That was what I told myself. The monster padded clumsily into the room, dropped something heavy on the floor, and then walked over to my bed. I still remember that stale, unclean breath on my face. I was trembling beneath the duvet, but I held my nerve and prayed the creature wouldn't eat me. And eventually, it slowly backed out of the room, closing the bedroom door. I remember when I was eventually certain the monster had left, opening my eyes to see Sophie lying atop her sleeping bag, still passing out. She must have been unaware of what happened to her in the attic. I sure hope so. I know now, of course, what I was too young to know then. There was something wrong with those suites. Just like there was something wrong with Grandma and Granddad insisting on me inviting Sophie and Francesca. But I also remember something else, something that unravels part of my dad's story. It wasn't both grandparents who invited my friends and gave us sweets. It was Granddad. I chose not to tell my father what I inferred from his story, but I do have to get to the bottom of this. So, this morning, I returned to my old ways of badgering Dad. "You must know more," I said. Grandma could still be hurting people. My dad scowled. "Kara, please. She'd be a very old woman by now. Even if the police never find her, she'll be gone from this world eventually. You're safe. I'm safe. Let's just move on. I thought you'd stop asking questions if I were to finally tell you the whole story. But it's not the whole story," I thought. "You must have read some of the letters she sent. Maybe she left clues," I said. "I read all of them, and I took them straight to the police. She hasn't written to me in about 5 years, so just drop it," Dad pleaded. "I'm sorry, Dad, but I can't get it out of my head. I keep thinking of those poor people, how they suffered. And this is coming from me. I didn't even see the photos. I don't know what he or she did. It must be far worse for you. You must want to do something. Nice guilt tripping," Dad said. "Yes, I do want to do something. That's exactly why I've been helping the police for years. I'm not protecting her. She may be my mother, but what she did to those people. Yeah, you're right. You have no idea. And I wouldn't want you to know. No human could do those things. Sorry," I sighed. "That was a cruel move. I just feel horrible knowing she's out there. And like you said, I'm an adult. I make my own decisions. So I want you to know that I'm not going to let this lie. I'm going to look for her." I expected Dad to shout at me, but he didn't. He sat thoughtfully at the kitchen table, twiddling his spoon in his cereal, and I waited patiently for a response. Yet again, he surprised me. "I'll tell you something," he finally said. I perked up, leaning across the table inquisitively. "The lead detective would check on us regularly," Dad continued. "Keep me updated on the investigation." And he told me about the immediate connection he drew after they finally poured through the thousands of photos. 36 victims. Every single one was brunette. It could have been a wild coincidence, but the lead detective didn't think so. Serial killers often have a pattern. I instantly shuddered. Another horrifying memory emerged from the fractured recesses of my mind. A memory that, yet again, I didn't have the stomach to share with my father. Around the age of 8, I distinctly remember waking from a sleepover at my grandparents' house to find a chunk of my hair, my brunette hair, missing. It had been sloppily chopped from the left side of my head during the night. I remember blaming Francesca, as she was the main prankster out of the three of us. She blamed Sophie. Neither of them owned up to it. I got in big trouble with my parents for that one. I really hope Dad doesn't remember that, or he'd probably put 2 and 2 together. Fortunately, his memory is abysmal. Oh, And, of course, my granddad's insistence that Sophie and Francesca attend sleepovers makes so much more sense now. They were both brunettes, too. I had a blonde friend called Lucy who would come over to play from time to time. But the sleepover invitation was never extended to her. It all makes me feel a little bit sick. I doubt that helps with your investigation, Dad said. But then we're not police officers, are we, Pet? Best to leave it to the professionals. And you're not going to tell me about anything you read in the letters? I asked. She never gave me any details as to her whereabouts. Kara, Dad sighed. She didn't want to be found. Then what did she write? I asked. Dad shrugged. Nothing that was ever of much use to the police, in all fairness. But I gave them the letters anyway. She endlessly requested forgiveness. And she asked questions about you, of course. About your mom, too. It made me angry when she asked about the two of you. Maybe she was worried about our safety. I absent-mindedly replied, without thinking about the words that had left my mouth. Dad raised an eyebrow at me. Kara, I know she was your grandma, and you loved her, but she wasn't the kind woman you remember. That was a lie, a facade she maintained for decades. It's taken me many years to come to terms with that, so I understand that it might take time for you too. I just don't want you to live in denial. I nodded my head, dejected at the prospect of never having any closure. But then my dad, as he always does, dropped the biggest bombshell as an afterthought. I suppose. Well, in one letter, she did write something that reminded me of my childhood. Love you, my North Angel. I miss our happy times. She used to call me that whenever we visited Gateshead. And I think we all went as a family, didn't we? Dad asked. I nodded. I remembered Grandma calling me the exact same thing. Anyway, the detective contacted police in Gateshead, but nothing ever came of that lead, Dad said, shrugging. But the line was far more significant to me. Dad was forgetting something, so I excused myself and headed upstairs to the main bathroom. Sure enough, atop a forgotten shelf, it still stood. The rather large angel of the North figurine that Grandma had bought while we were in Gateshead, a souvenir to remember happy times. She said that to all of us, and those words were used again in the letter to Dad. It seemed a bizarre reference to make. But as I removed the figurine, which had been untouched for more than a decade, I noticed a slip of paper stuck to the bottom of the ornament. It read, John, something's wrong. You should know that by the time you read this. If not, you might have stumbled upon it by accident. I suppose that would be better than it sitting unnoticed for years. Whatever the case, you need to tell the police that we're in Devon. Remember your dad's old caravan. That's where we'll be. He's leaving Lancaster soon, and I'll follow when the time's right. It's the only way he'll spare them. I can't do anything else to protect you. I don't have time to write anymore. I've already spent too long in here. Heart racing, I immediately crumpled the piece of paper and shoved it in my pocket. I didn't want Dad to find out. But this is, perhaps, one of the most perturbing pieces of the puzzle. Granddad forced Grandma to take the blame. Even though the note dated back to 2009, I knew that I had to go to Devon. Grandma might be long gone, as Granddad might, but I wasn't going to let this horror rest without finding out the truth for myself. And fortunately, I knew exactly where to find the caravan. That was another family. Holiday Dad's parents had repeated with me as a child. My dad was already at work, and I called in sick to my job. I didn't tell my dad where I was going. I jumped into my car, set the destination, and drove for 5 long hours from Lancaster to Devon. When I arrived, it wasn't quite the picturesque place I remembered. The UK has been bombarded with torrential showers over the past couple of days, and the sky was painted a murky, near-colorless gray. The horizon was an endless expanse of nothingness, footed by rolling green hills. And in the midst of a mostly neglected caravan park, there stood a rusty, forlorn, static home, Granddad's caravan. Yes, it was still there. And as I clambered out of my car, I was suddenly overcome by all-encompassing terror. The realization of what I was doing had hit me. I wasn't telling stories with my dad in the comfort of our home. I wasn't reminiscing on near misses from my childhood. This was real. I was standing before the home of the bogeyman. My boots squelched in the sodden, muddy footpath leading up to the caravan's front door. Rain beat mercilessly down on me, but I was glad of it. The deafening sound of the downpour was drowning out my footsteps. I had the element of surprise on my side, and when I reached the front door, I took several long, measured breaths before finally knocking on it. To my surprise, it swung open. I knew I shouldn't step inside. The lightless lair of the beast terrified me more than any of my childhood sleepovers. I suppose the knowledge of his heinous crimes, the crimes of a real-life man, made me fear him more than any imaginary monster. I bravely moved one foot in front of the other and crossed the threshold. Clearly, nobody had stepped foot in that place for a few years, at the very least. There were mold-covered plates in the kitchen sink, and I screamed as a rat scurried from a cupboard, disappearing somewhere into the blackness of the house. "Grandma?" I called. I don't know why I announced myself. I suppose I'd already accepted that nobody could possibly be living there. I should have just called the police like Grandma said, I thought. But if I'd done that, I would forfeited my one chance of finding any sort of evidence. So I pressed onward, flipping any light switch I could find. Nothing. Probably the result of unpaid electricity bills. Another good sign is that nobody lived there. Instead, I fumbled in my pocket for my phone, pulled it out, and turned on the flashlight. I wish I hadn't. The open-plan living area, comprising a kitchen and sofas, was an expansive room for a static home. It probably took up most of the caravan, 30 by 10 feet. Humongous, and every inch of the walls, every single inch, was coated in hair, 100,000 pieces of brunette hair. Most strands had a red tinge to them, and the entire demonic decoration was knotted in a crisscrossed pattern. The interwoven pain of a nightmarish man's victims. Terrified and sickened beyond words, I bent over and hurled onto the floor. Thankful, at least, to be eyeing something other than the horror that lined the walls. I quickly turned my flashlight to the corridor, which led to the back of the static home. I'd seen enough, and the sooner I could say I checked every inch of the caravan, the better. The bathroom was another moldy, forgotten room, hairless, thankfully, and so I moved toward the final room of the house. The bedroom. A room emanated a stench so powerful that I feared it more than the horror behind me. I didn't want to open the door. I really didn't, but I had to do it. And so, with the door handle in my sweaty palm, I lightly pushed forward. Vomit bubbled to the top of my throat again, as I found myself eyeing another room lined with meticulously intertwined hair. Hair that covered not only the walls, but the floor and every inch of the bed, every inch of the room. But that wasn't what horrified me most. What horrified me was the hairy lump merging with the bedding. Grandma, little more than bones. Well, I can only assume that to be the case because she too was coated entirely in hair. I'm only assuming it to be her because there was no way of identifying the body. I didn't have to get close to know she was dead, and I didn't want to do so. She was interlaced with the room's hair blanket, which had spread like a fungus throughout the interior of the house. I can't decide whether it would have been better or worse to instead see the corpse beneath. I turned to run, but on my way out, I noticed the wardrobe door was ever so slightly ajar. It beckoned me, though I knew great horrors lay within, but I had to do it. It was why I traveled so far, and so, stepping onto the soft, hair-blanketed floor, I walked towards the wardrobe and pushed the door fully open. I shrieked. The catalog. Those words were printed on a slim slip of paper, which was attached to the inner door of the empty wooden wardrobe, and a new collection of photos could be found glued to the back panel. Photos of me, my first day at university in Manchester. Back in 2017. Photos of me in clubs, restaurants. Even a photo of me sleeping in my dorm. He watched me sleep. I thought I had an empty stomach, but I surprised myself, unleashing another horror-driven stream of bile across the floor. But I collected myself and returned my gaze to the inside of the wardrobe. At least they're all photos of me, I thought. Maybe he hasn't taken any other victims. But they weren't all photos of me. On the inside of the other door, there was another collection of candid shots. Pictures of my mother. This will be my final update. Last night, my dad and I talked for hours about, well, everything. I'm not going to hide things from you anymore, I said, pulling out my phone. I took photos of the wardrobe. Dad calmly took my phone and started scrolling through the photos I'd taken. Oh God, Dad cried, pushing the phone back into my hands. Do you think? I started gulping. Do you think he's responsible for... Mom? Dad winced sharply. Kara. I don't want to. I don't want to. I understand why he'd prefer to believe that Mom took her own life, rather than believe that someone took it from her. And perhaps I don't want the police to uncover the truth either. Perhaps I'm done grieving too. But what I will say is that Mom's death in 2018, though seemingly self-inflicted, was unfathomably awful. A mangled corpse in a car wreck. And I can't help but wonder why she'd want to end her life so painfully. Anyway, I had the day off work, given the circumstances, and I spent it flicking through my photos, searching for answers. I couldn't stop thinking about the photo of me sleeping in my university dorm room. He's always watching. That's what Grandma said in her note. Maybe he traveled to and from their Devon hideout at first, but he likely didn't ever return after killing his wife and leaving her there. So where is he now? I wondered in horror, scrolling back and forth through my photos. There was a picture of Mom driving on the motorway, a picture Granddad had taken while he was driving too. In it, I could see the dashboard of his car and his left hand on the steering wheel, with his wrist donning a shiny golden Rolex. But most importantly, he'd captured his BMW's askew hood ornament. Distinctly askew. A sinking feeling consumed me. Dad, I said. My dad lifted his head from the newspaper. Yes. Is this the car you're always complaining about? I asked, showing him the photo. My dad's eyes widened, and he slowly nodded at me, his face turning a ghostly shade. For the past few years, he'd been moaning, on and off, about spotting a BMW with that exact shabby ornament around our village, parked in places where it shouldn't be parked, but it always moved before he could do anything about it. I think we need to call the police, he said. I nodded, feeling more than a little queasy. Dad couldn't remember when or where he'd last seen the vehicle. As I said, my dad's memory is awful, but I was sure it was only a month or so ago that he moaned about it being parked on a double yellow line around the corner from our street. That meant Granddad had been here for years. Am I one of his victims or not? I wondered, continuing to scroll through the photos while my dad talked to the police. Every photo of my mother and me was taken at night. He used the flashlight on his phone or the headlights of his car to illuminate his surroundings. And that made me think of other unusual things from the past few years. For instance, I often forget to draw my curtains before bed. Funny, given that I'm a light sleeper. And since lockdown, I can think of numerous occasions on which I was rudely awakened in the early hours of the morning. A car's blinding full-beam headlights would fill my small room. Every time, I'd grumpily get up and draw my curtains. That wouldn't completely block out the light from the road, but the car, strangely, would always drive away shortly afterwards, as if there were no point in staying without being able to see through my window. Another unusual thing comes to mind when I think of that dreaded photo Granddad took in my dorm room. Could he have been watching me sleep back home? I'm a forgetful person. I think we've established that. But at least once a week, I've been waking up in the morning to find my bedroom door ever so slightly ajar, and I'm fairly certain I rarely forget to close it. That terrifies me more than anything. The thought that he has been in our house close enough to touch me. Thank you, officer. My dad said this, hanging up the phone and turning to me. They're going to keep an eye out for a car that matches the description. As for the broader investigation into his location, they're looking into missing person cases from recent years. The detective is going to come over here personally and talk to us about moving somewhere safer. Somewhere. Granddad can't find us, "Won't Granddad just follow us?" I asked, trembling. Dad hugged me. "I know you're scared, Kara, but it's going to be okay. The police have it under control." As we waited for Detective Simon Smith, I'm not using his real name, for obvious reasons. All I could think about was the fact that the police didn't seem to have anything under control. They'd known of this horror for 14 years, and they were no closer to solving anything. Anyway, I wasn't expecting a dingy, brown Ford Focus to pull onto our driveway. I suppose detectives in TV shows and films lead a more glamorous lifestyle. The man who exited the car must have been in his early 30s. Though his coarse skin aged him, he had thinning, damaged hair, but a neatly trimmed beard. He wore a smart gray trench coat and black gloves. In that way, he seemed to conform to Hollywood stereotypes of the typical detective. "Nice to see you again, John," he said, shaking hands with my dad. "Same to you, Simon," Dad replied. "What's it been?" 4 years. Simon nodded. "About that, yes. I'm sorry. It's been so long since I've had anything to tell you." The case was, admittedly, gathering dust until yesterday's discovery. "And this is our hero, Kara, I presume." I nod my head, shaking his hand. "I'm really sorry, Kara," Simon said somberly. "What you saw in that house was something nobody should ever have to see, but you're incredibly brave and undoubtedly smart. Perhaps a career in detective work is on the cards for you." I smiled weakly. "Right. Well, I think the first thing we should do is find alternative accommodation for the two of you." "How does that sound?" Simon asked. "But my granddad will just follow us," I protested. "He won't, I assure you," Simon replied. "I'll be checking my tail the whole way." "How long will we have to stay away?" my dad asked. Simon shook his head. "We'll find him, John. Don't you worry. You've both been a massive help with this investigation. We've already found a BMW matching your description on numerous recent SecDiv tapes from business owners in town. I don't think it'll be long before he rears his ugly head." Realizing that arguing was futile, I went upstairs and packed a bag, and 10 minutes later, with our most important belongings in hand, we walked with Detective Smith to his battered Ford Focus. "So, where are you taking us?" Dad asked as we clambered inside and buckled our seatbelts. "A travelage in Manchester," Simon replied. "With any luck, we'll have him before the end of the week." As we set off, I watched my quaint little village roll by the passenger side window. The sun was setting, but the sky was still a calming blue. A settled, safe world surrounded me, in contrast to the rainy, chaotic few days that preceded it. "So, how did you do it, Kara?" Simon asked. I looked away from the window. "What? How did you figure out where to find your granddad?" he asked. I shrugged, nervously locking eyes with Simon in the rearview mirror. "Grandma left clues." Simon chuckled, parroting what I'd said. "Grandma left clues. Remarkable. I'm serious. You really should join the force. You're a damn sight better at this than me." It was as the car turned sharply onto a country road that I first noticed it. The sleeve of Simon's trench coat lifted as he steered to the left, and it revealed something beneath his black glove, a golden Rolex. My stomach immediately lurched. "Won't this way take us longer, Simon?" "We should have turned right to head towards Manchester," my dad pointed out. Simon didn't reply, and we very suddenly found ourselves on a bumpy, disused road, dwarfed on either side by towering oak trees. The daylight was fading, and I found myself gripped by unimaginable terror. Completely unable to say anything, I was unable to process what I'd seen. "Simon, where are we going?" Dad asked. "Dad!" I finally managed to croak. "You are home, Kara," Simon finally replied. He brought the Ford Focus to a stop in the middle of a wooded clearing, far from civilization, far from anything but a small, lightless shack of a house. And then there was a clicking noise. "What?" my dad began. "Get out of the car," Simon replied, pointing what I realized to be a handgun at my father. "What the fuck is?" my dad continued. "I won't tell you again," Simon warned. As my dad shakily opened the door and stepped outside, Simon turned the gun on me. His eyes were suddenly as untamed as his hair. "You too, detective," he said. "Get the fuck out." My dad opened the door for me, and we embraced as Simon quickly got out of the driver's side, pointing the gun at both of us. "Walk in front of me," he ordered. "Head towards the front door and don't run." As we walked, I didn't dare look back at the lunatic. I huddled closely with my dad and prayed that the nightmare would end. We could barely see our feet in the pitch-black forest, but we managed to stumble towards the front path of the shack. "Open the door, John," Simon said. My dad lightly pushed the rickety wooden door, and it opened onto a black chasm. "Move," Simon growled. "We can't see," my dad said. Something prodded me in the back, and I turned slightly to see a torch in Simon's spare hand. He eyed me coldly until I took it. I was afraid to turn it on because part of me already knew what I would see, but it was worse. So much worse than the caravan. My dad yelled, but I didn't voice my terror. Of course, I was certainly just as horrified to be faced with rotten walls, mostly covered in brown hair, but it was exactly what I expected. What I hadn't expected was that the floors were stained a dark brownish or reddish color. I think I know what it must have been, but there was just so much of it. Too much of it. "I'll let you in on a secret," Simon gleefully whispered in my ear, pointing at the walls. "Under that soft, silky brown blanket, you'll find a sturdy underlayer of smooth, skin-covered plaster." I uttered an involuntary yelp. Simon giggled. "Don't worry, Kara. It decays, as do all beautiful things. We can always go downstairs for more. But don't you worry about downstairs." My dad and I embraced one another again. "Head to the end of the corridor," Simon barked. "What are you doing, Simon?" my dad asked as we walked along the hair-walled, bloody-floored hallway through an empty, derelict bungalow. "Don't ask me," Simon replied, nodding at the door ahead. I shone the torch on the door handle, and my dad obliged Simon's request, twisting it. As the door lightly creaked open, I cast the light above my father's shoulder, not daring to squeeze past him. I hid in fear, and my father's gasp told me that greater horrors lurked inside the following room. "Dad!" my father gasped. I stepped inside, knees quaking, and found myself standing in a living room much like the one in Granddad's caravan. It was coated, much like the corridor, with interlaced hair blankets. Every wall, floor, and furnishing, everything but the fireplace, which burned brightly enough for me to finally turn off the torch. And then there was the man himself, sitting atop a brown-haired throne with its back to the fire. My grandfather, the bogeyman, but he was barely a shadow. He was 80 years old, at the very least, and he was an emaciated, skeletal man. How could such a pale, weak thing strike so much fear in me? "Sit," Granddad wheezed. Simon prodded the gun into each of our backs, and he shut the door behind us. My father and I sat on the soft, hairy floor, and it took every ounce of my willpower not to projectile vomit again. My dad was crying. "Why are you doing this to us, Dad? We're your family." "Family," Granddad repeated thoughtfully. He was little more than a silhouette with the fireplace behind him. A dark outline, a faceless monster, and before Granddad could elaborate, Simon walked to the side of his master's throne. "You really don't know who I am, do you, John?" Simon laughed, prodding the gun aggressively in my direction. "Why don't you tell her about her mother? Your slut of a wife." Simon laughed manically, and the light of the crackling flames danced across his scruffy, patchy head of brunette hair. "What are you talking about?" Dad asked in a croaky whisper. "What are you talking about?" Simon mocked. "You and Rachel. You were 16 and in love. It was the graduation prom. Your whore passed out and got knocked up." Dad had tears in his eyes, and he turned to me. "She was raped. We didn't want you to know. We wanted to spare you that story. It was long before you came along." My father weaved his fingers into mine, gripping my hand tightly. I managed to smile and nodded through my tears. This seemed to anger Simon. "Look at me," Simon said, but Dad didn't. "Look at me, you coward!" the psychopath screamed, suddenly unloading a round into the wall. The deafening roar of the handgun petrified me. I shrieked, squeezing the life out of my father's hand. Dad quickly lifted his head to lock eyes with the crazed man standing before us. "Tell her," Simon said calmly. "Tell her who I am." Dad's eyes widened, and he shook his head, finally having come to a realization. "Yes, John," Simon said. "It's me. The rotten thing that the two of you simply discarded at an orphanage 34 years ago. A helpless baby abandoned by my mother and my... Simon paused, smiling slightly. "Brother," Granddad finished. Silence filled the air as my grandfather's single word coursed through the room. The horror of the revelation struck me before my brain had even caught up. "What do you mean?" my dad whispered, though I knew he'd heard and understood, just as I had. "He saved me," Simon said. "Father, save me from the dump in which you left me." "Father," my dad cried, shaking violently. "She was perfect. You're Rachel." Granddad coughed. "Her hair. Perfect. When your mother grew old, Rachel became the new key to my pure bloodline. Dad, whose face was smeared with tears, started to wail, and I simply continued to tremble. This was far more terrible than anything I could have imagined. "Don't cry, brother," Simon whispered. "Your pain won't last long. You'll join the wall soon. Patience, son," Granddad croaked as loudly as he could muster. "There is an order to these things." "Sorry, Father," Simon whimpered. "The catalog." Granddad nodded lightly, and his son, brother to both my father and me, scurried out of the room in fear. The man on the vile throne then cast his gaze at me. With his back to the flames, I could scarcely see his face, but I caught a glimmer of something in the demon's eyes. Joy, perhaps. A demented form of joy. "Kara," he muttered, "there is another thing I have longed to tell you. Something your father doesn't know. Come closer." Lip quivering, I crawled across the floor, releasing my father's hand, and stopped inches in front of my granddad's throne. The man unfurled one of his shaky fists, caressing my cheek with terrifyingly gnarled, inhuman fingers. He leaned forward to whisper in my ear, and his following words will haunt me to the end of my days. "You are Rachel's daughter, but you are also a child of my purest bloodline," he groaned. "You will inherit my gift soon enough." I still want to pretend I misinterpreted him, but I know I didn't. He was my father. I crawled backwards, horrified and disbelieving, eyes stretched wide. I crawled straight into my real father's warm, comforting arms. How did this monster rape my mother twice? Sweets, I imagine, and now I fear what he might have been doing to me in my sleep over the years. "Why did you kill her?" my dad blubbered. Granddad sighed, though it was little more than a strained wheeze. "All perfect things must be preserved in the catalog. Otherwise, they tarnish." Simon re-entered the room, and I turned to see that he was holding a Polaroid camera in his free hand. "They're ready to be cataloged, Father." And, Simon began. Everything happened quickly. My father, utilizing Simon's brief moment of distraction, sprang towards him. He propelled himself from the floor with such speed and force that, when he collided with the detective, the two of them hurtled through the open doorway into the main corridor. And my granddad, if I should even call him that anymore, howled like a wounded wolf, supporting himself on the armrests of his throne and attempting to stand. I don't know what overcame me, but my body moved before my mind had even registered the situation. I lurched forward and roughly thrust my hands into my grandfather's bony, shriveled chest. He felt cold. Even by the fire, he felt cold. He and his throne of matted hair fell into the inferno, and he screeched at a piercing volume as the flames ensnared him. I stood in a frozen position, witnessing a truly horrifying spectacle of burning hair, flesh, and whatever else formed the boogeyman. But it was all over, far quicker than I expected. He was reduced to a charred mess, concealed by flame. "Father," I heard Simon splutter in pain. I turned to see my dad kneel on the madman's chest, launching punch after punch into his bloody, bruised face. "Kara!" Dad shouted, not taking his eyes off the monster he was bludgeoning to death. "Call the police." I quickly scooped my phone out of my pocket and dialed 999, and the rest is a blur. My dad managed to stop just short of killing Simon. I had nightmares of the detective's corrupt fellow police officers bailing him out and arresting us instead. But they swiftly surrounded the house and apprehended Simon without a moment's hesitation. I hope he never sees the light of day, but perhaps we should have pushed him into the fire too. Is that my granddad speaking? Have I inherited his insane bloodlust as he promised? I think I eyed the fireplace in a trance for a good hour or so. Eventually, I managed to pull my gaze away and leave with my father. Though there was nothing of Granddad left at that point, I just had to be sure I'd burn him to ashes. He spent so many years living in the shadows, an immortal specter that watched us night and day. I suppose I'll never truly believe that he's gone for good. After all, the bogeyman is dead, but his bloodline lives.